So there's been a conversation happening in the D&D space after, certain events that I talked about in my last video, and it's mostly been about whether or not a dungeon master, and therefore NPCs and monsters, should attack unconscious player characters. And before we really get into it, let's take a moment to clarify our terms. In D&D 5e, when a character hits 0 hit points, that means they go unconscious, and when they're unconscious, they have to make death saving throws. To do that, they roll a straight d20. If they get a 10 or higher, they succeed. A 9 or lower, they fail. If a creature gets 3 successes, that means they stabilize and no longer need to make death saving throws. They're not at risk of dying at all. If they roll a nat 20, they get back up to 1 hit point, and if they roll a nat 1, that means they fail 2 death saves. If an unconscious creature takes damage, that means they fail a death save. And if they're hit with a critical hit, they take 2 failed death saves. And if an unconscious creature gets hit with an attack within 5 feet of it, it is an automatic critical hit. So if an enemy within 5 feet of an unconscious player character attacks them, that means they're going to fail 2 death saves right off the bat. Considering that 3 failures means death, and a lot of monsters in D&D 5e can attack more than once, that means that an enemy could just kill a character in 1 turn if they're already unconscious. To be honest, it's pretty brutal, and there are a lot of arguments against doing this sort of thing. The 2 most common ones that I see are that it is metagaming and therefore unfair, and also just makes for a very unfun game because it's not very sportsmanlike. And on the flip side, there's a lot of arguments in favor of attacking downed players. Like, it's good battle sense to execute a downed enemy to make sure they don't get back up, and it being a useful tool to raise the stakes in a specific fight. So I want to take a look at some of the arguments for and against attacking down players, and finally answer the question, should a dungeon master execute their players? Or rather, player characters. Don't execute your players. The argument goes that most creatures, especially in the heat of battle, are not going to take the time to tell whether or not a downed PC is dead or unconscious. There's just not enough of an immediate difference between a dead person and an unconscious person that we can just tell and then attack the unconscious one and not the dead one. And to them, this is a real world, so they're not aware of the death saving mechanics. So if you attack a downed PC, this is purely metagaming because you don't know about the death save mechanics and you're just hitting a person who might be dead. The DM is using outside knowledge, their understanding of the death save mechanics, to make in-game decisions that don't make sense for the world. First off, this argument is more or less correct in its assertion that the difference between a dead person and an unconscious person is very difficult to tell, especially in the heat of battle. The 2 have been mistaken for each other throughout history uncountable numbers of times. There's a lot of ambiguity between just an unconscious player and a dead player. But the thing is, the ambiguity here plays against their argument as much as it supports it. Since this monster or NPC can't tell whether or not the player character is dead, they're not just going to assume that that character is dead. It's just as reasonable to assume that they're still alive. So depending on the nature of the attacker, it can still make perfect sense for them to attack the downed player. I think the thing that's really up in the air there is how long they continue to attack, whether they make 1 attack, 2 attacks, or none. I'll also add that I don't really think that kind of metagaming is necessarily a bad thing in D&D, because D&D is, at least in part, a strategy game. And us as the dungeon masters and players, using the mechanics to make decisions in-game is part of how, tabletop RPGs work. We have a series of rules and game mechanics that help us navigate their world, and it makes sense that if we have such a literal understanding of it, they probably have a fairly intuitive understanding of how their world works. So overall, I'm not really super convinced by this argument. I understand where they're coming from, but I don't really think it makes that much sense. The other big argument that I see against attacking down players is that it is, just for lack of a better term, unsportsmanlike. It's not fun. And part of the DM's job is to facilitate fun, both for them and for their players. And there are several aspects about losing a character that are not fun, including but not limited to the loss itself and the long waits that a player might have to endure between the death of their character and the introduction of their new one. These situations aren't fun and therefore should be avoided. Of these 2 arguments, I do think this is the stronger one because D&D is a game and it's supposed to be fun, because a lot of the time players don't like to lose their characters. They get very attached. They're their own creations. It can cause a lot of friction at the table, and it can cause some real world grief, especially if it happens in a way that feels anticlimactic or meaningless. That kind of stuff just feels kind of bad, you know? But do you know what doesn't feel bad? Liking and commenting on this video and then subscribing to my channel. That was probably my worst call to action ever, but whatever, I am sticking to it. But again, I do have some counterpoints against this argument, because sometimes losing a character, is really fun. If your character dies performing a heroic sacrifice or dies tragically after making a fatal error, those can become great story moments that you and your friends will remember and reminisce about for the rest of your lives. And a lot of characters, myself included, are happy to have our characters die if it makes for a strong narrative moment. But that sort of thing isn't easy to do, and it can go wrong really, really quickly. It's a little bit of a knife's edge. It can go either way. I've seen it done really, really well, and I've seen it done really, really poorly. So while I do find myself fairly convinced by this argument, I do think there's quite a bit of nuance that's missing. So let's move on to some arguments in favor of attacking downed players. In Dungeons and Dragons worlds, there is magical healing that can be performed in the blink of an eye. And basically everybody inside these worlds understands that to some degree. Even in low magic worlds where magic isn't super common, I'm sure there are legends of these things happen. And well-traveled folks like adventurers would probably have seen it a couple times in their lifetime. So any relatively intelligent enemy should understand that if they knock somebody down and there's a healer around, there's a solid chance they are going to get back up. And if they have survived long enough to be fighting adventurers, then they know that turning their back on an enemy is probably a very bad idea. In fact, this is something that soldiers throughout history have done a lot. If you take an enemy down and you want to stay alive, you should probably make sure that they stay down. Now, that might not necessarily end up with execution. It might be you just incapacitate them or tie them up, but honestly, in the heat of battle, you're not really gonna have time for those other options. So if you have a relatively intelligent enemy and they're not making sure their enemies stay down, then you're not really playing them right. And on like a purely logical level, I do agree with this argument because it makes sense to eliminate as many threats as possible if you're trying to stay alive or win a fight. But then again, going back to the previous argument, it might not be all that fun for your players to just get knocked down and executed. So yet again, there's another argument that I don't really fully agree with, but I don't fully disagree with. So let's look at one more argument in favor of executing players. And that is that attacking a down player is a really, really useful tool to increase the tension and raise the stakes at your table. When the enemy takes the time to attack a downed character, that is a really quick way to communicate to your party that stuff is getting real now. If you've ever done it at your table, you probably know that the room gets quiet. You could hear a pin drop and everyone starts holding their breath. It's a signal to your players that this combat is going to have consequences unless they're very careful. And personally, this argument is probably the one that I side with the most. One of my favorite things to do in D&D is to scare my players and to raise the tension and the stakes at the table. So this argument is kind of hitting me where I live. But once again, I don't fully agree. So overall, I think each of these arguments have some good to them and some bad to them. And as for the concept itself, I don't think it's wholly good or wholly bad. And I think that like most ideas and techniques when it comes to any form of storytelling or art, this is just another tool that you can put in your toolbox. It is really good for certain situations and really bad for other situations. Though I will add that this specific tool is a dangerous one. Applying it with the wrong techniques or in the wrong situation can make your game go pretty bad pretty quickly. You need to know whether or not your players are okay with this sort of thing. You need to know when it's appropriate to use it, and you need to know what you're going to do if it does result in the death of a character. The first one, knowing whether or not your players are okay with it, is pretty easy. You just ask them. And then when you do use it, pay attention to how they react and then ask them about it afterwards. Communication. Knowing when to implement it is a little bit trickier. You need to have some understanding of the nature of the attacker. Are they intelligent? Are they concerned with combatants getting back up? Or are they a savage beast who just wants to feed? And you need to think about the stakes of the encounter. Is this just a little side skirmish that is not very important and you don't want to kill any characters in it? Or is this a boss battle that needs to feel like there's something on the line? And you need to think about whether or not your table is prepared to deal with the death of a character. And you also need to consider what kind of game you're running. If you're running a brutal tactics game, this probably fits right in. But if you're playing just a fun, lighthearted adventure, this is going to feel real out of place. And knowing whether or not you are ready to deal with the fallout of a dead player character isn't so cut and dry either. And it's not just about your dungeon master prep. It's also about you and your table's emotional readiness for this. Because while some tables go through characters like it's nobody's business, other people get really, really attached to their characters and don't want them to die. But overall, attacking downed players is a tool you can put in your toolbox. You don't have to use it, but if you do it in a thoughtful and compassionate way. That was the first time I read that sentence out loud. That was kind of a weird one, but there we are. It's a really interesting tool that can be used in lots of fun ways in both your tactics and in your narrative. And this discussion has existed for a long time, basically as long as 5e has been a thing. But the most recent version of it was kicked off by episode 33 of Critical Role's third campaign, which I made a video breaking down. So thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.